So moving on, the final volume in the Cycle of the West is Song of the Messiah, about the ghost dance movement of the 1880s and the Wounded Knee massacre that occurred in 1890. So in one stanza in the opening chapter, we have a contrast between nature and the human world. The winter died. Once more, as though a wish too long denied, became creative in a fond belief. The old earth cast her ragged weeds of grief, and listened for the well-beloved's words, until her hushes filled with singing birds and many-rivered music. Only men were paupers in the faith to dream again, rebuilding heaven with the stuff of woe. So winter dies and spring renews in nature, but there is no renewal for the Lakota tribes. The frontier is closing and the world of the natives is disappearing. The warrior society is beginning to pass into the reservation system. As the problems of the Lakotas mount and they start to despair, they turn to spiritual leaders for guidance. And one of these spiritual leaders was Black Elk, a participant in the ghost dance movement. So here it's instructive to say a little more about Black Elk and the book Neihardt wrote about him, Black Elk Speaks. So why is this book famous? Well, it actually didn't really get that much attention when it was first published in the early 1930s. It wasn't until 30 years later it became a bestseller and sold 1 million copies. And it was largely on the basis of this bestseller status that Neihardt was invited on the Dick Cavett show. So Black Elk was a cousin of Crazy Horse. He fought at the Battle of Little Bighorn. He even killed a soldier and scalped him. And Black Elk describes this event. His knife was dull and the soldier's hair was too short, so it was kind of a gruesome affair, but he eventually got it done. Then he hung around for a while until the smell of blood started to make him sick, and he went home. And if you think he was a wimp for this, I should add that he was only 12 years old when this happened. And then later, Black Elk was present at the massacre of Wounded Knee. He was grazed by a bullet, but he survived because the leader, Red Cloud, told him to stop fighting. He also toured in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and even performed for Queen Victoria. So a fascinating guy, Black Elk, an eyewitness to major historical events, last of the Buffalo Hunters, and played an active role in the end of the Native American resistance. Neihardt approached Black Elk to interview him, and initially Black Elk was hesitant. He had already turned away other people who had showed up wanting to document his life. But this new guy was different, and Black Elk discovered a kindred spirit in John Neihardt. So in Black Elk Speaks, he recalls a very detailed mystical vision he had when he was ill as a child. And this vision dramatically changed the course of his life. Neihardt, interestingly, also had a fever dream when he was sick as a child that influenced his decision to become a poet. And when Neihardt told Black Elk about this, Black Elk said it was a power vision and that Neihardt was a sacred man thinker. Of course, Neihardt in turn said that Black Elk was, in spirit, a great poet. And it's fascinating that they each had these visions that changed their lives. The one became a medicine man, the other a poet. And that each saw himself in the other. Black Elk actually interpreted Neihardt's arrival at the Pine Ridge Reservation to interview him as a fulfillment of his vision. And Neihardt said that over and over he seemed to be quoting from my poems, and sometimes I quoted some of my stuff to him, which, when translated into Sioux, could not retain much of their literary character, but the old man immediately recognized the ideas as his own. There was this uncanny merging of consciousness between the old fellow and myself, and he seemed to have remembered it. So when Neihardt sat down to write Black Elk Speaks, he went off of transcripts his daughter had written in shorthand, which were painstakingly transcribed in this refining process of back and forth translation between Black Elk and Neihardt via Black Elk's son, Ben Black Elk. Neihardt did depart from the transcript and rephrase things slightly. He structured it as a first-person narrative centered around Black Elk's vision, and most significantly, he crafted an opening and an ending that are both very powerful. When I first read this, I had no idea that Neihardt actually wrote the opening and closing, but it's done in such a way that you could believe that this is what Black Elk thought and would have said. So when people wonder how much of Black Elk Speaks is Black Elk and how much of Neihardt, it is kind of both. And when we take into account this merging of consciousness the two men mutually seemed to experience, this is understandable. And so I think accusations of cultural appropriation and falsification are kind of simplistic when you're considering this fact. The last two installments of the epic cycle, Song of Messiah and Jed Smith, are quite different from the first three. Neihardt has always had this mystical side, but this aspect of him really takes over after his conversations with Black Elk. Now, as I said, Black Elk was a medicine man and played a crucial role in the ghost dance movement that arose in the 1880s. So, this movement centers around a leader named Wovoka, who became a prophetic figure who told of a Messiah to come who would usher in a better world for Indians, who would remove their sin of selling the earth to the whites. He said dancers would rise into the sky at the turn of the millennium if they wore eagle feathers in their hair. So you can see a lot of parallels with Christianity here, and the ghost dance movement has been described as a mixture of Christianity with Indian beliefs. Wovoka claimed to have seen this Messiah figure who actually bore the crucifixion wounds of Christ. And interestingly, the movement was also influenced by the Shakers, and the ghost dance consists of spiritual trances very similar to those of the Shakers. So this is how Neihardt describes this Messiah figure in Song of the Messiah. And now behold, a man was standing there beneath the tree, his body painted red, a single eagle feather on his head, his arms held wide. More beautiful he seemed than any earthly maiden ever dreamed, and all the soft spring nights that ever were might be the one of all to look on her. He had a father's face, but when he smiled, to see was like the waking of a child who feels a mother's goodness bending low. A wound upon his side began to glow with many colors. Memories of earth they seemed to be, of dying and of birth, of sickness and of hunger and of cold, of being young awhile and growing old in sorrow. Now he wept, and in the rain of his bright tears the holy flower of pain bloomed mightily and beautiful to see beyond all earthly blooming. And the tree was filled with moaning. All the living things with roots and leaves, with fins or legs or wings, were bowed beholding. And a sudden change came over them, for all that had been strange between them vanished. Nothing was alone, but each one knew the other was known, and saw the same. For it had come to pass the wolf and deer, the bison and the grass, the birds and trees, the fishes and the streams, the horse and man had lost their little dreams, and wakened all together. So the purpose of the ghost dance was to resurrect the dead, and when the Messiah arrived, he would usher in a new world. So what would this new world be like? Well, as it happens, we have an account from no less than Black Elk, who, as I said, had a vision of this world when he was a child. And here are Neihardt's lines. And then it was beneath the withered tree, young Black Elk stood and sent a voice and wept. And little had he danced until he slept the sleep of vision. For a power lay upon him as a child, and men could say strange things about his seeing that were true, and of the dying made to live anew by virtue of the power. When he fell, the sun was high. When he awoke to tell the silent crowd that pressed about the place of what he saw, with awe upon its face, the full moon rose and faltered, listening. It was, he said, like riding in a swing, afraid of falling, for the swing rose high, and faster, deeper into empty sky it mounted, till the clutching hands let go, and, like an arrow leaping from a bow, he clove the empty spaces, swift and prone. Alone he seemed, and terribly alone, for there was nothing anywhere to heed the helpless, headlong terror of the speed. Until a single eagle feather blew before him in the emptiness and grew into a spotted eagle, leading on with screaming cries. The terror now was gone. He seemed to float, but looking far below he saw strange lands and rivers come and go in silence yonder. Far ahead appeared a mighty mountain. Once again he feared, for it was clothed in smoke and fangled with flame and voiced with many thunders. On it came, and passed beneath. Then stretching everywhere below him, vivid in the glowing air, a young earth blossomed with eternal spring. And in the midst thereof a sacred ring of peoples throve in brotherly content, and he could see the good red road that went across it, south to north, the hard black road from east to west, where bearers of the load of earthly troubles wander blind and lost. But in the center where the two roads crossed, the roads men call the evil and the good, the place was holy with a tree that stood earth-rooted yonder. Nourished by the four great powers that are one, he saw it soar and be the blooming life of all that lives. The Holy Spirit that the good grass gives to animals, and animals to men, and they give back unto the grass again. But nothing dies. And so this is a very interesting intersection between the poem and the more famous ethnography, because this information was conveyed by Black Elk to Neihardt during their conversations, and you can read a prose account of it in Black Elk Speaks. Now, white authorities misinterpreted the spiritual, otherworldly nature of this movement and thought it was a preparation for war, so they became very alarmed. And there was some cause to think this because something gets introduced called the ghost shirt. It was a cotton cloth that was painted blue, and the Lakotas believed that when they wore it, they were impervious to bullets. And who was it who introduced the idea of the ghost shirt? Well, yes, it was none other than Black Elk himself. And here's how Neihardt puts it. In his vision, he sees 12 men and 12 women standing in a ring around a tree, and he says, I saw their garments, and I wondered much what these might mean, for they were strangely wrought. And even as I thought, they heard my thought and sang reply. The people clad as we shall fear no evil thing. And then these 12 women and 12 men vanish, and after the vision ends, it says, when the shroud of moony silence fell upon their woe, young Black Elk spoke again. What shall be so forever, I have seen. I did not sleep, I only woke and saw it. Do not weep, for it is only being blind that hurts. Tomorrow you shall make these holy shirts for us to wear the way I saw them worn. Clothed in the Holy Spirit, none shall mourn or come to harm along the fearful road. So the next day, all the women start sewing these ghost shirts out of rags and sacks to make unearthly raiment, richly wrought indeed for all the love they stitched in every hem, and good old men of power painted them with sacred meaning. Blue upon the breast, a moon of promise leading to the west, the end of days, and blue upon the back, a morning star to glimmer on the black and fearful road. The neck and fringes red, the hue of life. So then a white agent, Hugh Gallagher, comes to witness this ghost dance, and he sees them wearing these ghost shirts that are again, supposedly, bulletproof, and Neihardt describes Gallagher's thoughts. So clearly they were mad, these dancing heathens, ludicrously clad for superstitious doings in a day of Christian light and progress. Who could say what devilment they hatched against the whites? What lonely roofs would flare across the nights to mark a path of murder? It must cease. So Gallagher tries to stop the dance unsuccessfully, and then he flees. But after this, the white fears of this ghost dance movement are really stoked, especially because the ghost dance is spreading wildly in popularity. It's taking all the tribes by storm, and there's obviously going to be a culmination to this, a coming conflict. The US Army mobilizes 9,000 soldiers, a third of its force, to suppress the ghost dance movement. There are also the Indian police, natives empowered to use force against their own people, and in the following chapters we encounter Sitting Bull, who is wrongly believed to be contributing to this ghost dance movement, and the increasing Indian hostility associated with it, so the Indian police try to arrest him, and he is killed along with several followers. And of course, Sitting Bull's martyrdom augments hostilities. His followers flee and find refuge in the village of his half-brother, the Lakota chief Sitanka, also known as Spotted Elk, also known as Bigfoot. And so he takes over the leadership, and in the next chapter, he gives a speech, and one stanza of this seems crucial to the larger meaning of the poem. He says, Great Spirit, give us eyes, he prayed, to see how sorrow can be wise, and pain a sacred teaching that is kind, until the blind shall look upon the blind and see one face, until their wounds shall ache, one holy wound, and all the many wake one being, older than all pain and prayer. So there's a reference to the Messiah again here. And I'm going to come back to this in just a bit, but if we fast forward to the next and final chapter, everything comes to a head at Wounded Knee. The army shows up to Spotted Elk's village, tries to take their guns, starts searching the village. A soldier tries to wrest a weapon from a native and a shot rings out, and then havoc breaks loose. Neihardt doesn't spend a lot of space describing the scene that ensues in much detail. Again, I already noted his tendency for that. And here the action is nondescript, it's couched in terms of a lament. And here's how it begins. A gunshot ripped the hush. The panic roar outfled the clamor of the hills and died. And then, as though the whole world crucified upon the heaped Golgotha of its years, for all its lonely silences of tears, its countless hates and hurts and terrors, found a last composite voice, a hell of sound assailed the brooding heavens. Once again the wild wind roaring of the rage of men, the blent staccato thunders of the dream, the long-drawn, unresolving nightmare scream of women and of children over all. Now at last the peace of love would fall, and in a sudden stillness very kind, the blind would look astonished on the blind, to lose their little dreams of fear and wrath. So there is a comparison to Golgotha, place of the skull, Calvary Hill, a direct reference to Christ's crucifixion, appropriate given the whole Messiah theme. Now, in the last lines, we have the blind looking astonished on the blind to lose their little dreams of fear and wrath. And we see a connection between this and what Spotted Elk had said in the previous chapter. And so the massacre occurs, Spotted Elk is killed, and the final lines of the poem, the lines that close this epic cycle, read, The bugles blared retreat, triumphant in the blindness of defeat. The iron-footed squadrons marched away, and darkness fell upon the face of day. The mounting blizzard broke. All night is swept the bloody field of victory that kept the secret of the everlasting word. So we have this line, and darkness fell upon the face of day, which is set off against the other lines and constitutes its own kind of one-line stanza, essentially. This seems to reference the earlier stanza in the Spotted Elk's speech, the blind shall look upon the blind and see one face, and in that context it seemed to be about the face of the Messiah. Here, it's the face of day. And what else? There seems to be an ironic commentary here about the true identity of this Messiah, that the Messiah ended up being the face of the white man who shows up to just slaughter everyone. Also notice how the last line, the secret of the everlasting word, is not followed up with another line that completes the couplet. There's no end rhyme to match with word, it's left incomplete, which suggests, of course, this secret, the message of love, the message of the Messiah, remains a kept secret upon the bloody field, and that cultural understanding remains unresolved. And also in the opening of the Song of the Messiah, we encounter these lines that, when you could feel things waking underground, and all the world turned spirit, and you heard still thunders of the everlasting word, straining the hush. So again, like in the final stanza, the everlasting word is referenced in the beginning of the poem, so it all comes back full cycle. Now earlier I referenced in the Song of Jed Smith another reference to the everlasting word, invoked by the slow hushed solitude of pine. And here again we encounter it. So you can speculate as to exactly what Neihardt means about the everlasting word. It obviously represents a mystical truth, not just in the biblical sense, but as a concept that reconciles dichotomies. That there's the bloody field of war on the one hand, but also the peace that silence brings. In a similar way that the yucca tree symbol in the Song of Jed Smith embodies this mystical paradox that pain and beauty are one and the same thing. So this epic ending with the reflections on the everlasting word is not exactly an inspiring ending, right? It's very tragic. We see the closing of the frontier, the end of the native tribe's way of life, the coming of civilization, the coming of the 20th century for all that brought. Neihardt is obviously very sympathetic to the passing of this way of life, but he's fatalistic about it too. And there's another dimension to this lament for the passage of the old ways. It's not just his subject that's passing out of history, it's his genre as well. He is writing this in the outmoded genre of the epic. And so, like the participants of the ghost dance movement, Neihardt seems to be trying to resurrect the dead with his stylistic choices here. So I read this epic cycle in the order that it is presented in its published edition, and that is how Neihardt himself intended it to be read. However, I would not recommend reading them in chronological order. Reading it in the order that it was written shows the development of Neihardt's thoughts more, and it also minimizes boredom. I would say read Hugh Glass first. It's not only the first one written, it's the best of the Fur Trapper epics. This amounts to starting off with a bang in the opening act, as opposed to the relative narrative drag of Song of Three Friends, which is the weakest of the 5 poems. So read Hugh Glass, then Three Friends, then Indian Wars and Song of Messiah, then conclude with the more reflective, contemplative Song of Jed Smith that was the product of Neihardt's mature years. Because the opening lines in the final chapter of Jed Smith are a fit conclusion to this epic. The low intoning of the canyon grew, filling the silence of a story told with something immemorially old, beyond all telling. And in this sense, A Cycle of the West is kind of like the Star Wars saga, which should always be watched in the order the movies were made, rather than starting with the prequels that spoil everything. And much like you're best off skipping the woke sequel trilogy of episodes 7 to 9, just pretend like that never happened. You're also better off ignoring the scholarly industry that accuses Neihardt of cultural appropriation and chides him for how he should have dramatized his story. Although again, the footnotes to the Bison Classics edition are very helpful, I drew on them heavily for this video, and again, Neihardt's biography, Lone Dreamer by Timothy Anderson, is a great read that defends the poet's status in the world of letters. And Anderson describes Neihardt's later life. At the University of Missouri, he taught a course on Epic America and attracted large numbers of students. As Anderson describes it, he would stand facing the class with his arms up and his head looking skyward as he sang Indian songs, mostly in a raspy and sometimes falsetto voice, without any embarrassment. One student remembered watching him as he stopped reading from the book and instead recited from memory, with his eyes locked into a vision only he could see. Anderson continues, between classes he was often found sitting cross-legged on the grass in front of the classroom buildings, facing the sun, eyes closed, hands in his lap. One of his students was George C. Scott, the famous actor. Scott wrote that Neihardt influenced him. He was short, and when he sat on his desk his legs dangled. His hair was bushy and stood up as if electrified. He was a man of great charm and a marvelous teacher. Anderson also writes in the epilogue to Lonesome Dreamer how Neihardt was disappointed at the reception of his life's work. To quote Anderson, he had never regretted not achieving great fame or fortune, for neither had been his goal. What he had always wanted was for his work to endure, and for most of his career he had thought his most lasting work would be his Cycle of the West. For nearly 4 decades, he had believed the cycle would endure long after he was gone, that readers would eventually flock to it, and he would be thought of in the same way he thought of Tennyson. His heroes would lead readers across the pages of his poetry, and he would preserve their exploits and, more important, their values for all time. When it did not happen, he was devastated. But then, quietly but quickly, he moved on. He simply taught his students, making a textbook of his beloved cycle, turning a new generation on to Jed Smith and Hugh Glass, Crazy Horse, and Red Cloud. When his complete epic was published, the poet Robert Hillier wrote to Neihardt, and he made this prediction. The publication of your epic songs in one volume is a literary event, the importance of which will be more and more recognized as time goes on. As the oily tide of Pound and Eliot and the vulgar aestheticism subsides, the American people will make the happy discovery of many fine works which have not been sufficiently recognized. Among these, your Cycle of the West will stand in monumental beauty. So Neihardt never did attain the status of an American Tennyson, but I think there may be more hope for Neihardt in the 21st century than there was for him in the 20th. Nebraska has played a large role in keeping Neihardt's memory alive. In addition to publishing Anderson's recent biography, The University of Nebraska Press also re-released their authoritative annotated edition that I've been mentioning. Each year at a state historic site dedicated to the poet, the John G. Neihardt Center holds an annual conference in the town of Bancroft to celebrate his works, and continual sales of Black Elk Speaks ensure that, at the very least, many people will be reading his prose. His portrait now hangs in the Omaha Public Library, and there's also a bronze statue of him with Black Elk. This also just leads me to reflect that the enshrinement of a prospective national epic works very differently today than it did in the past. If you're Caesar Augustus and you're holding the manuscript of the recently deceased Virgil, which you have just saved from being burned, you can say, "This is great. This is going to be our new national epic." And you can just make that pronouncement, and if somebody doesn't like it, well, you can just have them killed or something. But whereas today, in our modern capitalist democracies, it's all about the bestseller status and who the prize boards are elevating at the moment. Poetical fame in a democratic age really is this revolving door where there's just too many figures and most of them aren't good at all. And on top of this, in an age where people are confused about their values, an epic that celebrates heroes isn't likely to come to the fore. But despite the fact that the Cycle of the West has not been embraced as a national epic, I still think it's the best attempt at the epic genre that's been written by an American. And your first thoughts might be, well, there's not really a lot of competition there. Clarel is massively overshadowed by Moby Dick. Most people don't even know that Herman Melville spent his years after Moby Dick writing a long narrative poem. And the epic John Brown's Body, though it won the Pulitzer Prize 100 years ago, has also been half forgotten. Epic poems just don't capture the imagination of Americans in the same way that Virgil's Aeneid captured the imagination of Romans, or certainly that Homer did of Greeks. There's a lot of reasons for that, and it's not really hard to speculate why that is. If you go to Neihardt's Wikipedia page, it describes Black Elk Speaks, but doesn't mention the Cycle of the West at all. Personally, I think it's kind of stupid that Neihardt is remembered for this one book, as fascinating as that book is. It's kind of like if Zora Neale Hurston was remembered for her book Barracoon, where she interviews the last survivor of the last slave ship, instead of being remembered for her classic novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. Barracoon was written right about the same time as Black Elk Speaks, and without a doubt, these are interesting and important documents, but they're just not as good as the masterworks these authors wrote. The main problem with A Cycle of the West is that it is a 19th century style poem written in the wrong century. Had it been written 100 years before it was, who knows? Neihardt's name might be associated with the fireside poets or the names of the American Renaissance like Thoreau and Dickinson, etc., but he isn't. He resisted the modern aesthetic trends, and the establishment responded by ignoring him, just like they do today when you buck the trends. But thanks to the internet, classical poets are now able to get around this somewhat by bringing their poetry directly to the people. Even in Neihardt's own day, especially outside the Midwest, a lot of reviews of his work were not favorable. In a 1926 review in Poetry magazine, the critic noted that the general critical attitude towards Mr. Neihardt has been, "Too bad he writes in rhymed pentameters." Now, this critic did have some favorable things to say about Cycle of the West, even while promulgating the opinion that free verse is better than formal verse. And time and again we encounter this viewpoint that there's this necessary equivalent between democracy and freedom and free verse poetry, that free verse is distinctively American, and that writing in rhyme and meter is a European old-fashioned throwback. And I want to emphasize that while this view is very entrenched in academia, the common person does not really think like this, which goes pretty far in explaining why Neihardt's memory remains alive in the Midwest, particularly in Nebraska. He remains an important regional poet, even if he's not an important national poet, and his status is obviously very low in the academy itself. Another review of Neihardt's work, also in Poetry magazine, also in 1926, described his epic as pretentious, pseudo-Miltonic grandeur that demands an elaborate apparatus of commentary to understand. And as I've said, I don't think this is true. I do think that you need to have a basic familiarity with American history, and with the history of Western civilization and literature more generally. Hence the helpfulness of footnotes, but basically, as long as you're not stupid, you can understand the epic just fine. And to the extent that people might not understand it, it's because they've largely forgotten the past. Epic, its function and purpose is to encapsulate the values and knowledge of a civilization, and one reason for the decline of epic in the West is that we just don't have common values anymore, and we especially just don't value the past. But if there's an upside to the Neihardt criticism, it's this, that at least he was getting reviewed. Most neoclassical poets today don't get reviewed at all, and certainly not in Poetry magazine. I'm lucky that I've had my work reviewed in conservative media, but outside of that sphere, nobody will touch a patriotic epic with a 10-foot pole. Neoclassical poets also have no chance of being named Poet Laureate in probably any state. So Neihardt definitely benefited from living in an earlier age prior to the rise of the intellectual class, where he was selected to be Poet Laureate directly by the Nebraska legislature, not by an academic committee. Nebraska was still largely undeveloped at this time. A lot of elected officials came from farming backgrounds. And personally, I think we need to get back to this. The average person's aesthetic judgment, as flawed or unsophisticated as it might be, is still more trustworthy than the judgment of your typical literary expert whose worldview is filtered through postmodern theory. Now, when Neihardt was growing up, many frontier folk had volumes of the works of William Shakespeare in their log cabins, and this was a very common thing. And that meant that these bumpkin plains people were all much more familiar with iambic pentameter than we are today. And while that tradition eventually faded, it faded more slowly in the Midwest than in other places. Modernism was largely confined to sophisticated urban areas, especially the Northeast. So, in the region where Neihardt was, what he was doing was not really considered anachronistic. Most importantly, he was writing formal verse at the same time Ezra Pound made it his mission to break the iambic line, and succeeded in doing so. Neihardt was the graduate of an educational system that emphasized classical learning rather than pragmatic career-oriented skills. Epic poetry, again, is a genre for a more aristocratic age. Democratic citizens don't have much use for erudite high art. Take the values of the pre-modern age like honor, glory, faith, knowledge in the wide sense of that term, and replace them with efficiency, skepticism, relevant job training, and just being nice. Now, I've quoted Tocqueville before in my videos, but it's worth emphasizing here. Tocqueville well describes how democracy gave us instant poetry. Democratic literature will never exhibit the order, skill, art of aristocratic literature. Formal qualities will be neglected or actually despised. The style will be strange, incorrect, loose, and almost always strong and bold. The main themes of epic tend to be honor and glory, whether of a conventionally heroic nature as in martial epics, or spiritual glory as in the great Christian epics. And the pursuit of glory and the celebration of remarkable individuals are simply not democratic values. If anything, epic values, if you want to call them that, are antithetical to egalitarianism and conducting business as usual, and all the socially cohesive values that we associate with our republic. Now, Neihardt's characters all fall in this tradition. His heroes are humble people, but people who tend to exist outside the normal stream of society. Whether they are explorers or native warriors fighting to preserve the way of life, their values are not our values. And yet, there is a certain emptiness in modern life that makes us fascinated by those bygone lifestyles. I mean, how many popular movies are about this theme? So I really just have to give a shout out to the Nebraska people for recognizing the merits of this great epic poet. In Nebraska, like much of the Midwest, I'm a Missourian, there's this reputation that everyone is just a lowbrow redneck. But this is a case that shows how Nebraska has really been ahead of the curve. And by naming an epic poet to the laureateship for over 50 years, has in fact been a leader in the promotion of real culture in a way that few of the coastal states are anymore. And in an age where so much poetry and art is just totally degenerate, both in an aesthetic and a moral sense, the red states of the Great Plains are keeping values alive through their art. I think it's fitting to conclude with the words of John Neihardt himself. Neihardt concludes his introduction to his 1953 edition of the collected poems with the following passage. I can see now that I grew up on the farther slope of a veritable watershed of history, the summit of which is already crossed, and in a land where the old world lingered longest. It is gone, and with it all but 2 or 3 of the old-timers, white and brown, whom I have known. My mind and most of my heart are with the young, and with this strange new world that is being born in agony. But something of my heart stays yonder. For in the years of my singing about a time and a country that I loved, I note, without regret, that I have become an old-timer myself.